Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So in this video, we're going to cover market equilibrium. What we've done up to this point is we've established supply curves and demand curves. To get equilibrium, we start by putting those together. But before we go into that, I want to talk a little bit about the intuition here. So the demand curve represents the relationship between price and quantity for the good in question for consumers. Remember, this is what one of the functions that prices are going to accomplish, is it's going to convey the value that consumers put on the good. So when I draw a demand curve, I don't want you to think of this as something stale and uninteresting. We want it to really come through as you visualizing what is it when I go to consider purchasing something, the value that I place on that good. That's what's happening here. Supply, on the other hand, represents the alternative uses of the inputs, or how it is that suppliers value all the things that go into producing a particular good. In this case, that's going to mean the use of their time, the use of the inputs, the use of the space, anything that they have to buy, and what the alternative uses of what they could be putting that money towards. So this is all about opportunity cost, and it's all about value. So it's those ideas that we started off the entire class with. Now that I've drawn these together, of course your eyes are immediately drawn to the point that we care about most, which is the intersection of those two curves. In this class, for the sake of principles, we'll be doing mostly what we call static analysis. So that's why we're going to focus on equilibrium. So dynamics is how things are going to change over time. And it's not that we're not going to have a lot to say about that in this class, but when it comes down to actually extracting a price and a quantity, we'll be doing it when we get to an equilibrium point. That's static analysis. Okay, so here's our equilibrium point. And this is an important point because this is the price. There's your price that balances quantity supplied against quantity demanded. So this is our equilibrium quantity, or sometimes you'll see it as Q star, or so on. So equilibrium is when market forces are in balance such that there's no net force pushing the market to reach a different pair of price and quantity. So think back to like some physics that you've had, right? And if you've got forces pushing one way and forces pushing another, you come to an equilibrium. Things stop moving around when those forces are in balance. So same kind of idea here, right? So what we're going to do next is we're going to go over what happens when you're out of equilibrium. But let's think for a moment what that looks like. If we are out of equilibrium, then there's some force at play that says the way that this good is being valued by consumers and the way that it's being valued by suppliers is not equal to what the market price, that information that price is conveying. Okay, so price is conveying that information that we talked about, right? Information on how buyers value the good and information on how suppliers value the alternative uses of the inputs, right? If we're out of equilibrium, those forces are not balanced out. So that's why I'm focused on this price here, getting us to this quantity here. Okay. So what happens if we're out of equilibrium? Let's start by showing. It's good to go through this exercise, which is why I didn't pre-draw any of these. I want us to kind of see the way that everything comes together. That helps us like understand what's happening. What happens if there's this market out there? Let's think about a concrete example. So I'm going to come up with a new brand of shoes here. Right? So I'm competing in the market. There's many alternative types of shoes. The demand curve represents how people value the shoes that I'm producing against their alternatives, right? They could be buying a different set of shoes. And then the supply curve would represent me producing the shoes and the alternative uses of my time and the inputs and the money that are going into it. So remember, one of the things that we said back in the ideas lecture is, I mean, you can set any price you want as a seller of a house, same in any other market. But the market forces are going to bring that into balance. We're going to talk about competition later in this class and why that's so important. But this is instructive. So suppose that I set this price and I say, okay, here's the price. Now, when a price happens, when a price emerges, is the word that I'd like to use, but I'm setting this price right here. So a price is set. Okay, so it isn't emerged yet. But there's a price and you run into it. The consumers are going to say, well, here's this price. How much of that do I want? How do I value this? So all the consumers make their individual choices, and we get the quantity that ends up being demanded. Okay, so all I'm saying is, if this is the price, this is how much people want. Very straightforward, right? On the other hand, what happens? How many do I want to produce at that price? Well, I set the price nice and high. That means I want to provide a lot of them, right? The price is high. That means that the many alternative uses of the inputs are going to be lower than the amount of revenue that I can be getting from this price, and so on. Now, this immediately establishes there's a big problem here, right? Because if I want to supply that many, but people don't want to buy as many as are out there, the difference here is a problem. And it's what we call a surplus, right? So people look at that and they say, well, at this price, this is how many I want. And I say at this price, this is how many I want to provide. How is it that a market price then emerges? Well, I'm left with a bunch of supply that I can't sell. I can't sell it because the price is too high and not enough people come to buy those shoes. I got shoes sitting all over the shelves. What happens when you have any kind of product in your retail store and you've got way too much stock of it? You put it on sale, right? You lower the price of the thing. Okay, so let's do this in steps. Let's say I don't learn my lesson super fast, and I think, okay, I can get away with this price here. Well, I reduce the amount that I want to sell then, right? And consumers at that lower price then increase the amount that they want to buy. Let me make my notation a little cleaner here for you guys. And we get this second quantity. Quantity demanded. Here's the amount that I want to supply. That's still going to be too many left on my shelf. How do I get rid of those? I lower the price. This process will continue until we reach the price that balances those two things. Now you see the price comes across and intersects supply, and I get this, right? If I also look at how I come across to that price, I see, hey, that's the point where I also get quantity demanded. So at this juncture then, we say quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. That's my equilibrium price. So there's equilibrium there. Okay, let's take another example. So again, drawing these things for the sake of seeing how this all evolves. So there's supply, there's demand. Let's consider the case now of new iPhones. So what happens? We initially set out some price. Maybe I shouldn't have said exactly iPhones. Imagine some smartphone. If the price is nice and low, the technology is cool, it's new, everybody likes it, so the demand response is going to be very strong. At that nice low price, quantity demanded is really high. However, at that price, how many do you want to sell? Well, the amount that you want to sell is actually quite low. So now what's this difference called? That gap there, quantity demanded much greater than quantity supplied, it's called a shortage. What does this look like? Well, you open your store, and everybody comes and snaps everything off of the shelf, and there's just a complete shortage of all the products that people want. And the sellers realize, actually, we can sell more, and we can charge a higher price. Okay, I'll dispense with these in-between steps from before. The price will rise. There's upward pressure on the price until we reach the point where quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. Same condition as before. Okay, so what we want to do now is think about some examples of what happens when we get changes that force a new equilibrium point after we have some situation. So this is really what makes all of this type of analysis useful, and why I've repeatedly called this the workhorse model in economics, right? So I've done everything to get us to this point. Here's your equilibrium quantity 1. There's your initial equilibrium price. Okay, let's say this is the market for baseball gloves. I guess technically you'd call them mitts, right? Baseball gloves. Everybody calls them gloves. Mitts is an old school word. Now, imagine for a second that all the cattle in the world have more offspring. Now, how does that relate to the market for baseball gloves? Well, baseball gloves have two components in their market, right? One is how people value baseball gloves. That's consumers of baseball gloves. That includes everybody from Mike Trout, the best player in baseball, all the way down to me buying a glove and buying my son a glove so that we can go play catch in the backyard. Okay, so there's your market for baseball glove. The demand curve represents the summation of all the people that are in that market. The supply includes everybody that's in the market supplying baseball gloves. So this is Wilson and Rawlings and so on. Lots of glove producers out there, Mizuno. And so who's affected by this? And this is how we're going to want to be able to apply market analysis, equilibrium analysis to things, is to investigate how it is that we see a change in a market going to affect the eventual outcomes in that market. So if we're thinking about cattle, of course, are an input into, sort of indirectly, input into the production process, right? Because this is where we get leather. A lot of baseball gloves are made out of genuine leather. If we have more of that, then the price of that will fall. That's an input cost. An input cost falls. We remember the result from the previous videos. We know that if the input cost falls, it's cheaper to produce at the same prices. We're happy to produce more of it. So we're going to have an increase in supply. So just always as a side note, right, our supply moves left and right, not up and down. So moving to the right is an increase. Okay, so what happens? Well, if the price is initially left the same, then there's, at this price, the same quantity is ending up demanded. So actually, let's notate that first. This would then be the quantity demanded, but we'd have the situation where the new amount that wants to be supplied is all the way over here, and so we end up with this quantity supplied over here. There you go. You have a surplus again. So the result then is that the price needs to come down so that consumers want to consume more and suppliers want to supply less until we find these things in equilibrium. That is to say, right, I don't want to give the impression that it's like markets happen and then this price is out there and everybody knows what it is. This markets are a process, and the process, so the real idea here is that there being too many gloves out there will cause the price of gloves to want to come down because there's downward pressure because consumers want too few and suppliers want to provide too many. That's going to force downward pressure. In order to sell one of the new gloves that you're happy to produce, you have to offer it at a lower price. So remember, this is a process, and this is pressures on the price rather than just snapping to some static equilibrium price. So that's going to keep happening until we reach this new equilibrium. So price comes down and quantity comes back into equilibrium as quantity supplied falls, right? And quantity demanded rises to meet this new equilibrium point here. Okay, so this is an example of how we would see a change in supply lead to eventual market outcomes. Let's take another example. Okay, so now let's consider baseball bats. Baseball bats. Okay, so we've got demand. So this is how consumers value. I want you to think that every time you see a demand curve. This is how suppliers value the alternative uses of the inputs. There's our nice equilibrium point. There's our quantity, equilibrium quantity. There's our equilibrium price. Okay, now suppose that the price of baseball cleats falls. Price of cleats falls. Okay, so how does this relate to the market for baseball bats? Well, cleats are a complement in consumption. If you want baseball bats, you also want to use baseball cleats with them. So if you're going to play, right, you want to have the cleats, and then so when you go to play, right, you have your specific shoes to help you grip the ground better and run faster, change directions quicker. That is a part of your gear that you're going to play baseball. So suppose the price of cleats falls. We've identified that this affects consumers and demand. So if the price of a complement, so PC is price of complement, if that ends up falling, that means that you will want more baseball bats in this case, right? So go back to our hot dog and bun example, right? If buns are cheaper, then the total cost of consuming a meal centered around hot dogs goes down. So our demand will rise. Demand will rise. Okay, so there's our second demand curve. Okay, so we can do the same kind of analysis as before, right? If the price stayed the same, then this will become the quantity supplied only, right? Where our new demand will result in this higher quantity that people want. So now we got a shortage over time. People who are supplying baseball bats realize, hey, we're always selling out. We can charge a higher price, and that also causes there to be more available, right? So there's a really powerful outcome here. That process, price is rising, and quantity supplied rising combined with quantity demanded falling gets us to this new equilibrium, right? So we reach this second equilibrium point here, right? So the eventual effect then is that the price will rise and the amount being both supplied and consumed will rise, right? So let's take a quick look at that. Price rise, and the sort of net effect is that quantity rises. So more people want the good because the complements are less expensive to consume along with it, which causes the total amount in the market to go up, and price ends up reflecting that. So notice what's happening here, right? The increase in price, so this mechanism here, is the driving factor. As consumers, we often say, oh, I don't like it when prices go up. I don't like it when prices, or I do like it when prices go down. And we sort of moralize about price. And I definitely understand that mindset as an individual. You know, I'm never happy when the price of something I want to consume goes up either. But remember that the price is what's driving this mechanism because it's conveying that information, which is part of why we'll talk about price gouging later on in this class. It's part of why artificially limiting prices is dangerous because it closes down that signal of information that causes suppliers to bring more to the market. So this is a good outcome that we're seeing here. Okay, last example. So now what I want to do is really the most tricky thing here. So let's consider a market. Let's consider a market here. And this time, now we're going to consider, let's stick with baseball bats here. And we've got this nice equilibrium quantity and this nice equilibrium price. Okay. And so suppose for a the first thing that happens, I'm going to have two things here. The first thing that happens is there's a study that comes out and it says, hey, baseball is actually much better for the health of young players than other sports. Football would be a good example. Okay, so study finds baseball good for health, right? At the same time, and this is really the trick, right? At the same time, the government gives a subsidy on the lumber purchases. So they want to increase the amount of wood creation and sales in the United States. So some subsidy on lumber purchases. Subsidy on lumber purchase. Okay, so we want to think about what that is. Well, if a study finds baseball is good for kids, and suppose people believe the study, that's going to reflect which, the supply or the demand? Well, that's going to improve tastes or preferences, which of course affects demand. If the taste or preference for something goes up, demand goes up. At the same time, we got an increase in subsidy. Pretty straightforward. The subsidy is on the purchasing side because it's affecting producers, right? And so we know that means it's going to affect supply. If you subsidize something, you are sort of effectively lowering the cost, increasing the profitability of it. So we're going to see an increase in supply. Okay, so let's notate those two things really quickly. Demand goes up, supply goes up. So supply looks like that. Demand looks like this. Not my best line. Demand looks like that. Okay, so there's demand 2, there's supply 2. Okay, so now what happens? It's actually sort of tricky now, isn't it? Because we've got all these lines here. So we want to start by identifying which two curves are actually the ones that are happening now in the present time period. Well, that would be supply 2 and demand 2, right? So we want to find where those two things intersect. That happens right about here. So we see sort of an immediate issue, right? Which is we've seen both supply increase and demand increase before. And so it's pretty clear we're going to have a quantity increase. We're going to get this second higher quantity. But what's happening over here on price, very difficult to tell. Okay. And so if we were doing an intermediate course or really a graduate course or something, we might talk about the relative elasticities. We'll cover that next week, right? So we'll talk about elasticity. It's very important. But the shape of the curves, the location of the curves, and the relative size of the shift. So notice what I've done here. I made both lines roughly 45 degree, or really all 4 lines roughly 45 degree lines, and I made the shifts roughly the same size. So it kind of, probably if you're looking at this, it kind of looks like price is going up. That's an artifact of how I've drawn this, though. So if we're doing an actual analytical assessment of this, what I want us to do is to use a little chart. Use a little chart here and say what happens when we have these different kind of increases. Okay, so first thing that happened, demand went up. So when demand goes up, what happens? Well, we saw that case a minute ago. Price goes up, quantity goes up. Price rises. I guess I don't need to notate price there. Price rises, quantity rises. What happens when supply goes up? Well, we know that price goes down, but quantity goes up. So now let's think about these as a net effect. So put the total down here. Well, this is pretty clearly an increase. That we've already notated, right? That happened right here. But this looks like looks like offsetting things. So we don't know which is happening. Is the price going up or going down? It depends on the relative size of the effects. So I'm going to leave this notation here just like this, because the net effect of what's happening here is unclear. So you can have quiz questions that are going to test you to exactly that effect. So what happens if we have this and this happen? And part of what you'll want to do is make yourself a little graph just like this, or a little table just like this, and work out the sort of net effects of those things. So if you've got what demand does, you've got what supply does, the rest should be relatively easy.